Well, thank you very much. It's nice to see all of you back here again. I hope you've been having a productive week and that you are pretty much done with your at least initial version of your En-ROADS presentations. And anyway, that's great. And I'm looking forward to tomorrow. We are incredibly lucky today to be seated with two of really the global leaders in many issues associated with energy. Energy security, the environmental impacts of energy use, the economics of energy use. And so it's a real treat to get to hear the perspectives, many of which I think really might surprise you, to hear the perspectives of the people we've got here. And I'd like to begin first by turning to Secretary Shultz and ask you to say some remarks. I think a lot of people probably don't realize that you are one of the earliest cabinet members involved with the environment. And that was perhaps...
I was the first administrator of EPA.
That's right. So got really great credentials to talk about this subject. So please.
I thought I would tell a few stories about my experiences to make 2 points. First, that the subject that we're all involved in, energy, is of paramount importance. And second, that right now is a particularly propitious time to be working at the subject. So, story one. I'm Secretary of Labor in 1969. I'm made by the President the chairman of a cabinet task force on the oil import program. President Eisenhower had thought that if we imported more than 20% of the oil we used, we were asking for trouble in national security terms. So security and energy get tied. And we were getting ready to bump up against that. That's the reason for the task force. We made a good study. We published our report. We said, the security problem is not military. It's because there's so much tension between the Israelis and the Arabs in the Middle East that you never know when that big source of oil is going to get cut off. So we should restrict our imports from there. We should have storage so we have a little insurance capacity. And we said, we've studied this subject, but there's nobody else in the federal government that knows anything much about this. There ought to be some sort of a unit in the government that's keeping track of energy because it's important. The President thanked me for my report. There were congressional hearings. Nothing was done. It taught me how hard it is to get something accomplished, even when it's perfectly obvious. So a little while later, as was said, I'm secretary. Well, a little while later, I become OMB director, and the EPA gets created. President Nixon signed that order. And when a new organization is created in the government, it has to get formed by getting space and people from other agencies, and there's nobody to speak for them. So if you aren't careful, they get the worst. So the director of OMB becomes their spokesman, and we're pretty good because we know where the bodies are buried and nobody wants to mess around with us. So we got it started. And in the process, I talked to a lot of the young people that I had, there were some that were part of the task force I'd had, who were very interested in being part of the EPA. And I talked to them a lot about, well, why? What do you think can be done? And some of the excitement, some of the obvious problems, some of the things you could do if you worked at it. So I got that into me. Then I'm Secretary of Treasury, and along comes the Arab oil boycott, just about what we had predicted. But all hell broke loose. We produced a lot of electricity by oil. Christmas lights were prohibited. Gas stations closed on weekends. It was a real national security problem and a huge economic problem. So we did restrict our imports. Finally, the Department of Energy got created, and various other storage capacity. But by this time, I have seen national security problems, I've seen economic problems, I've seen environmental problems connected with this subject. So some years later, I'm Secretary of State, and there were lots of scientists who thought that the ozone layer was depleting. But there were some who doubted it, just like now. A lot of people think X, people doubt. So I discussed this carefully with President Reagan, and we decided that we should reach out to the doubters and say, look, you agree that if it happened, it would be a catastrophe. So let's all get together on an insurance policy. It's an interesting concept. Concept of insurance is there's risk out there. You hope it doesn't happen to you, but if it does happen to you, you've made a preparation. So we were able to include them. In other words, you don't bash your adversaries, you reach out and try to pull them in. I always think governance is the art of inclusion. So we got that going, and there came into being, through the DuPont company, it's interesting how when something important gets clearly identified, the creative juices of the American entrepreneurial research sort of kick in, and something happens. In this case, the DuPont company came up with something that people could do, not what you aspire to, what you can do today. So we managed to get that going, and it wound up in something called the Montreal Protocol, which is the only environmental treaty that ever really worked. It worked. And people put these devices in. We created a little fund for poorer countries so that we could help them do it, so it became universal. It also was clear in retrospect that the scientists who were worried were right. And the Montreal Protocol came along just in time. So I have all those lessons in my mind. But there's another one. When we had the oil boycott, people would come in to me, since the Treasury was running this, with ideas about alternative energies and efficiency and things like that. And I thought that some of them were pretty good and encouraged them. As soon as the price of oil went back down, everything stopped. Everybody lost interest. The same thing happened when the Iranian Revolution came in 1979. And people got interested, and as soon as the price of oil went back, everything down. We've been on this roller coaster. Now, and this is why this is such an important time, now there is the largest body of first-class scientific and engineering talent and economic talent working on this subject that we've ever had here in this country, but also around the world. And my conviction is that it's really important, and I think it's going to happen. We can sustain this level of R&D, and when we do, that's where the future lies, in what's being created. Not too long ago, we had a meeting. I chair the MIT Energy Advisory Board, so I get to do both Stanford and MIT. So on behalf of Stanford, we at the Hoover Institution convened. 12 scientists came from MIT, and we got a similar number from here. I think we had one from Berkeley and one from Livermore Lab. So we could say it was West Coast. And we spent 2 days talking about game changers as we identified various areas like solar and so on. And people exchanged ideas on what they were doing. And then about a year later, we had a return visit. We all went to MIT, and we had a similar show there. And then we got together, and we published this book called Game Changers. You can all get copies if you want. I brought a couple along here. And this is just an effort to put down what is being accomplished. And we looked for 3 areas. Examples of things that are now in commercial operation which emerged out of R&D. Examples of things that are really on the cusp, and it's perfectly obvious we're going to get there with a little effort. And things that are further away, but very competent people are working on them. And if they happen, big time. My favorite example of that is large-scale storage. And that's going to happen, but we're a ways away. So, And the book is full of little examples. We have little takeouts, as you can see. It's text, but then they're takeouts. Scientist X plugged this in and took this away and did something else, and all of a sudden a new battery emerges, and so on, little examples. And then we knew there were other universities were doing things, and we wanted to get a sense of the reach. So we wrote to some and invited them to give us some examples. So all through here are examples scattered from other universities to give people an idea that this is a widespread thing that's going on. So I think right now, why is it especially important? Well, there's the security, there's the environment, there's the economic things that are standard, but there's also come along something else. I think myself the two real existential threats to our humanity are number one, nuclear weapons, and number two, climate change. Just as in the case of the ozone layer, they're doubters. I tell them, you better be careful, you're going to get run over, you're going to get crucified by reality pretty soon. We have a fellow over at Hoover, he recently retired as Chief of Naval Operations. So he has a task force studying the Arctic. Why would a Navy guy be interested in the Arctic? Well, there's a new ocean being created there. That has happened since the end of the last ice age. Why? It's getting warmer. You know, if you don't like the science, I think it's kind of impressive myself, but if you don't like that, use your eyes. It's a new ocean. It's being created. There it is. It's reality. And it has all kinds of implications of what, but it's also telling you that the globe is warming. And just as in the case of the ozone layer, there are big-time consequences. So we need to be figuring out what to do about it and what kind of alternatives there are, how we can use energy more efficiently, how we can get energy from other sources that are more benign. I might say efficiency is the cleanest energy you can get. Tomorrow over at Hoover, we're having a conference on small nuclear reactors being led by Jim Ellis. He's a retired four-star admiral who ran the regulatory agency for the nuclear industry in the United States. So he's very knowledgeable and very respected in the nuclear arena. He once commanded a carrier. A carrier is propelled by a small nuclear reactor. It's a promising technology. But there are all kinds of things going on that are really promising. So I believe myself that if we can keep after the R&D, there's a lot of support for it now, sustained. We'll get good ideas, and that it is a particularly important time right now because it's not only the economics and the security and environment, the air you breathe and so on, but it's also the climate and how we interact. Now here you're in California. Everybody says we're a bunch of nutcases out here. You go east and they say, oh, you're crazy. I say, yeah, there was a big meeting in Washington I addressed recently, and they brought this up. I said, yeah, we're all nutty out there. We really care about the air we breathe. How nutty can you get? So all these things are involved. And I look forward to learning things that you people are going to discover. Thank you.
Thank you. So just to follow up a little bit, so could you say a little bit about revenue neutral carbon tax? What is that and why you've been such a vocal supporter of that idea?
Well, I think that the essence of the matter is to put a price on carbon. And then people will start reacting. And personally, I think it only is what creates a level playing field. Because those forms of energy that produce carbon are imposing a cost on society. The carbon is not healthy to breathe, and it is clearly associated with global warming. So those producers should bear that cost and not get away free. That will make the level playing field. So I have advocated a revenue neutral carbon tax. And it's getting a little traction now and then. I say revenue neutral, so the tax mafia get off my back. I say this is not, if it doesn't generate revenue, it's not a tax. It's got a purpose. It's focused on putting a price on carbon so people will react to that and look for ways of saving, of changing away from carbon-producing forms of energy and moving to something better. So I've been a big advocate of that. And cap and trade is a price on carbon. We have that in California now. Mary Nichols, who I know well, is administering it. Cap and trade is better than nothing, but it's not as good as a carbon tax, in my opinion. And the revenue is being used to produce a high-speed rail in California. I say, wait a minute. If you're going to use the revenue, at least support research, R&D, and energy or something like that related to the subject.
Okay, well, thank you. Let's turn to you, Secretary Perry. You have your own set of perspectives on the global energy system, and we'd be delighted to hear your thoughts.
Thank you, Sally. I'm going to take a look from 40,000 feet at the energy situation, get a broad perspective of what's happening, what might happen in the future. I'm going to look at what are the game changers, number one. Number two, what are their consequences? What will their consequences be? And number three, what could go wrong and what could go right? So that's a broad outline of what I'm going to be talking about. So what are they? And you know them as well as I do. I'm just going to talk a little bit about a few aspects of some of the more important game changers. Number one on my list, probably on yours too, is fracking. In the case of natural gas, it's already mature, already having a profound effect on the market, and has a potential, though, much greater than what we've already seen, and I'll get to that. That's fracking for natural gas. Fracking for oil is well underway, not yet fully mature, and again, has a very great potential. And I think that potential will be realized. Next area is biofuel. It's been in the R&D phase for many decades. It's always the technology of the future, it seems. So I'm going to go way out on a limb, and say, I forecast it's going to be commercial, not just out the level, commercial in a year or two, and it's going to be commercial at scale, significantly commercial, in the 5 to 10 year period. And that will have a pretty profound difference, make a profound difference. On renewables, which have gotten a lot of the attention, a lot of the publicity in this field, they're promising. Over the last few years, they've gotten down to be approximately competitive at the grid equity scale, which is the good news. But they are very far from scale, and it's hard to imagine the set of circumstances which are going to make them significantly at scale in the next 10 years. I mean, we're talking about 1% or so of the electricity generated. So getting up to 10% or 20% is going to take a long, long time. And we need to
interrupt, Bill?
Pardon?
Can I interrupt for just a second? On my house at Stanford, I have solar panels. They were put there about 6 years ago. If I did it today, they'd be better. But I've long since paid for them by what I've saved on my electricity bill. And I'm driving an electric car around campus. So I'm driving on sunshine. Costs me nothing. What's not to like?
Well, I guess I'm driving a plug-in Prius, which is mostly electric. But I have to say, there's no economical reason for my doing that. I'm doing that because I like to do it. If there were an improvement in batteries of about 2 to 1, or even 3 to 1, that situation would change. Cars like the plug-in Prius, cars like the Chevy Volt, would all of a sudden start to become very competitive. And Tesla might be able to sell a car to the mass market instead of to the elite market. I'll come back to batteries later, but what's holding up renewables right now to a great extent is battery technology. So far I've talked about supply side energy, but there's a very great potential in improving on the demand side. It gets overlooked much of the time, but it's extremely important. And what's especially important about it is that the technology is already here. That is, you can already describe improvements to commercial buildings, say, for which the payback period of what you do to get the reduced energy use is measured in 2 years, say. So that's the good news. The bad news is that in spite of that, the acceptance has been very slow. So that's a quick 40,000-foot look at some of the main things going on. I want to say some of the principal game changers in energy today. Now, I'm going to raise the question, what are the consequences of these game changers? The consequences to our economy, to our national security, and to climate change. Those are the three big issues here. As far as our national economy is concerned, we are on the way, I think, to achieving a net positive balance of trade, which is profoundly different from where we were a couple of years ago. The biggest contributor today is natural gas. Oil is coming into the picture also. But those changes already have made a big difference in our balance of trade, and I forecast will lead us to a net positive balance of trade could lead us, I should say, to a net positive balance of trade within a few years. Closely related to that is our national deficit. And the annual deficit continues to be huge in this country. But just the change that's going on that we're talking about here in energy alone could make a big difference in our national budget as well, that balance of trade being a major contributor to that issue. If I look specifically at one issue in our national economic welfare, which is our manufacturing, for decades, the United States has been in a precipitous decline in manufacturing. So the net liability of the country to a great extent has caused jobs to flee the country in huge dimensions. The fracking can be an important contributor in turning that around. It's already been a small contributor. 5 years ago, 10 years ago, American manufacturers could not compete with manufacturers in Japan and China, especially in China. That is changing. For one thing, the cost of labor has been going up in China for the last 5 years. Today, Mexico, for example, is already competitive, maybe can outcompete China in manufacturing because their labor is less and you don't have the cost of transportation. And in not distant future, I think the United States will be competitive as well. We have two things going for us here, really. The first is the increasing cost of labor in China, and the second is the decreasing cost of energy in the United States. In China, cost of energy is only going one way, which is up. In the United States, it's going down. And so those manufacturing plants for which energy is a significant part of their total cost are going to start to rise in competitiveness. I am on the board of two companies, high-tech, they're no longer startup companies, but they're breakout companies. It's companies you probably have not heard of. They're just going into the manufacturing phase now, significant manufacturing. And both of them have decided to do the manufacturing here in the United States. One of them even is designed to do it in the Bay Area, which is almost unheard of. But that is happening. And one of the reasons it's happening is because we are now starting to, as a country, starting to become more competitive in manufacturing. And the two factors which primarily drive on that is the decreased cost of energy and the increased cost in China of labor. The second consequence of this is national security. Our national security, among other things, depends on our economy. And so what I've described about improvements on our economy, the national security is just a beneficiary of that. But beyond that, there are several issues which are specific to national security. If we look today at the national security problems we are facing in Europe, in particular, Russia and Ukraine, the aggressive actions of Russia, in my regard, in my opinion, have hinged almost directly on their position as on their position in the energy market. They are a huge surplus supply of natural gas, and they're a major supplier of Europe for natural gas. And the proceeds from their natural gas and their oil, most of which is owned by the government, are basically what supports the government. Their national government budget stems primarily from proceeds from their energy. Some analysts have evaluated that at $80 a barrel, Russia is sort of at a break even. Going below $80 a barrel, they're in deep trouble, and above $80 a barrel, they have surplus for which they can do things like embark in adventures in Ukraine, such as they're doing today. We have the potential, not immediately, but over the years, of providing liquid natural gas to Western Europe. Western Europe itself has the potential of doing, by using fracking, to gain some natural gas. So there is a potential for changing the European dependence on Russia for gas, which is both a direct national security consequence and an indirect, in that it will reduce the ability of Russia to fund militaristic adventures. Now, finally, I want to comment on the consequence. I want to comment on climate change. I see fracking as a holding action. I mean, because obviously the oil and gas you get from fracking still put CO2 in the atmosphere. I call it a holding action, though, because it allows us to shift over from coal-fired generation plants to natural gas-fired. And that's been happening, and that's a significant benefit in the United States. Contrast that with China, where they are still building, by some figures, two coal-fired plants a week, and therefore the prospect of their CO2 is only going in one direction, which is up. There will be no significant turnaround in China's CO2 emission until they finally get their new nuclear plants online, which is quite a long time away. And let me go now to the next point. There's some positive things in what I forecast here. My question is, what could go wrong? What could go wrong with the rosy part of my forecast here? The biggest single thing that could go wrong would be that we have a major fracking accident, an environmental disaster, which could be to fracking what 3 Mile Island was to the nuclear energy. In other words, a really serious fracking accident, which did significant damage to the environment, could simply put a stop to the fracking work that's going on today. I don't think that's a high probability, but it's not remote either. And the way to prevent that is to get adequate regulation on the fracking. The danger here is that wildcat frackers will skimp on the procedures, the processes they should use. So what we need in the fracking is a best standards processes accepted by the whole industry and imposed on the whole industry to lower the probability of this kind of an environmental disaster occurring with fracking. Because the national security aspect, the national economic aspect of losing fracking would really be quite profound. The second thing that could go wrong is sort of a generalization, which is everything takes longer than you think. So I gave you some pretty optimistic forecasts about biofuel. Gave you some hopeful views about new battery technology, but then instead of taking a few years, that could take 5 or 10 years. And so things sometimes take longer than you forecast. So a few things that could go wrong, which I call the blackbirds But there are a few bluebirds too, which is what could go right, what could go even better than what I've described here. And I think the significant thing that could go better is that the biofuel, instead of could go commercial at a significant scale in less than 10 years. I think that is a prospect. I wouldn't predict it with confidence, but I think that is a real prospect. Second, that could be very significant near term is if we had a breakthrough in the acceptance of the supply side technologies, the building of new commercial plants to really significant environmental standards. The potential is there for doing that. If Steve Chu were here today, he would tell you that one of his objectives when the 4 years he was the Secretary of Energy was trying to get a greater acceptance, countrywide of these supply side technologies. But he would also tell you that he was very disappointed with the results that he got. So some breakthrough is needed there. Nobody has quite figured out what to do to stimulate that breakthrough to happen. And the final bluebird, the thing that could happen, not yet in the forecast, is we could have a breakthrough in battery tech. If you tour around some of the laboratories here at Stanford, you'll find several different projects underway trying to improve battery technology. But a 2-to-1 or a 3-to-1 increase in battery technology could be really profound. And it is a prospect, at least, that could happen in the next year or two. I'm going to sum up my comments then by saying I've given you a brief description of some of the game changers. I've talked about some of their consequences, and I've talked about things that could go wrong and things that go right, the bluebirds and the blackbirds. I think on balance, my net is that the bluebirds are more likely than the blackbirds. Thank you.
Thank you. So before we open this up to questions, I actually have one question for you, and it's prompted in part by some remarks from one of the speakers earlier this week. And to what extent do you think that the dramatically increased use of nuclear energy around the world, not really in the US, but around the world, poses a risk for nuclear weapons proliferation and dirty bombs? I mean, is this something that we should really be worried about, which would hinder, slow down deployment of nuclear power around the world, or is this a misplaced fear? And this is a question for both of you to...
As soon as you say the word nuclear, you know that things are organized so risks are low, but the materialization of any risk is gigantic. So that's the equation. In the case of nuclear power, of course, the spent fuel needs to be reprocessed. What you reprocess can be turned into a weapon. The knowledge and art necessary to convert fissile material into a weapon has been shrinking. So it's a threat, it's a problem. And that's why there's so many safeguards and efforts to keep control of this. And that's why Iran's program of enrichment is of such concern. So I think it's a concern.
Yeah. So do you have anything else you'd like to add to that?
We have already in place, the international community, processes and regulations that would make nuclear reactors not present a security danger, to the extent those regulations and processes are followed. The danger is not that we don't know how to do that, or we don't have the right process. The danger is that a country that wants to use a peaceful nuclear technology as a dodge, as a cover for going nuclear, can't do that. They can find a way of gaming the system. North Korea is a primary example of a country. They started off with a peaceful nuclear program under the International Atomic Energy Agency supervision. When they got to a certain stage in the process, they just left. They withdrew from the IAEA, threw out the inspectors, and started building nuclear weapons. And the so-called peaceful nuclear program, getting a huge head start on that process. Recognizing that problem, having it exposed by North Korea's action, the IAEA has established something called an additional protocol, which is set up to prevent that from happening again. But not all countries in the world have been willing to sign that protocol. So the process is there with the additional protocol to keep this from being a danger, but countries have to agree to do it. So it's a political problem at this point, not a technical problem.
Okay, all right, thanks. Okay, so what I'd like to do is open this up to questions, and yep, anything, yeah, how about we'll start back there. And please speak up.
Yeah, my ears aren't very good, so.
Secretary, you talked about biofuels development being a good thing in the short term, say 10 years or so. What do you think of the implications it has on food security and the economics of food and how corn is priced and so on, and the subsidy load that the government has to bear?
So the question is, if the biofuel industry is to really take off and scale, say in 10 years or so, what would be the implications of that on food security?
On
Food security, yeah, food, the world global food supply, yeah.
Yeah, the biomass industry I'm talking about is using waste biomass, not food. It's using corn cobs instead of corn, or corn stovings instead of corn, or it's using switchblade grass. So I'm talking only about, it only makes economic sense if you're using waste material, not if you're using corn. To me, making fuel out of corn is a loser from the word go, for the reasons your question suggests.
Oh. Okay.
I agree with what Bill said, but there's another aspect to it. And that is, with the changing climate, we're seeing big ice melts all around the world. And these giant ices are the source of water. And if they go away, then people will be looking for where are we going to get water. And if you don't have water, you don't have food. So I think there's a giant connection between our work on energy and how to get cleaner energy and so on, and the impact of that on water and therefore food. So it's regionally, it varies, but it's a big problem. Okay. We're very familiar with the drought in California, I might say.
Okay, yeah, we'll go over here, and then I think there was someone in pink behind you. Did you have a question earlier? No. Okay, all right, we'll just start with you. Yep.
So Secretary Shultz, you've been witness to two of the major, environmental changes in the United States: the creation of the EPA under a Republican president, and then the Montreal Protocol you mentioned. I was wondering if you could comment on the political conditions that were present at that time that are not present now to create those sort of needed climate regulations and things like that in the United States.
Well, it's been 25 years since I was in office, and I don't understand Washington now. I mean, I was at President Eisenhower's Council of Economic Advisors. I did work for President Kennedy. I did work for President Johnson, and of course in the Nixon and Reagan administrations. And you could always bring people together and say, look, here's the national interest, let's go. Never a problem. Here, somehow, people have forgotten how to reach out. I gave the example of the ozone layer and President Reagan's approach. It wasn't to have a big fight with the people who disagreed with it. He figured out how to reach around and include them. That's what governance is about, and that's what we got to get back in the habit of doing. And perhaps we took this Stanford MIT group to Washington, and Sally was there. And I asked the Speaker of the House, John Boehner, to organize a meeting of our little group with the Republicans on the House Energy Committee. So these are supposed to be the bad guys. So we took our group, and selling energy R&D to that group was an absolute piece of cake. If you go about it right, there's no problem. They agree. Where they don't agree is you say, okay, if somebody gets a little patient with R&D, government's going to go into business and compete, you lose everybody. So I say, a cylinder or two will ruin the support for energy R&D. So stop. Don't do that. There are plenty of companies around, if something is operational and scalable, who are anxious to do that. That's what they do. They make money doing that. So this was an example, and I think you'll agree with me, Sally. It was no problem if you go about it right. And I hope that we go about it right. We can.
Okay.
I remember Lyndon Johnson. I was interested in unemployment in the ghetto. And Lyndon Johnson had little White House task forces that were not secret, but they weren't publicized on their subject. So he called me in and asked me to chair one on unemployment in the ghetto. So I agreed. And he says to me, George, if you have a good idea, and it turns out to be your idea, not likely to go very far. But if that idea becomes my idea, just might go someplace. Am I making myself clear? So we came up with a good idea, and I'd have to say he took it and he ran with it brilliantly, and it did a lot of good for a while. So you get back into that frame of mind. When Bill was Secretary of Defense, well, there were Republicans and Democrats, but you didn't have any trouble on any major issue in getting broad support. Bill did a lot of really tough, difficult, important things. And there was plenty of support because President Clinton, I mean, whatever, he knew how to schmooze around and get people interested in doing things.
So that's some recommendations. Practice your schmoozing skills. Okay, back there, question. Yeah.
As the U.S. goes toward energy independence, or toward it, not anytime close, do you see changes in U.S. Political census on a global scale changing anytime soon in our lifetimes, or do you see like a changing American politics regarding its energy independence towards the world changing anytime soon, or probably not?
Yeah, well, I think the question is, and I'll paraphrase it, American energy policy, such as it is, do you anticipate that it's going to change anytime soon?
Will it change Americans' politics towards other countries anytime soon?
Right, so will our stance towards other countries with regards to energy policy change anytime soon, or do you think, would you like to give a specific example of a type of policy or?
Alliances.
Oh, okay, so alliances. So you're specifically thinking about the Middle East and, yeah. So basically, I think you're asking the U.S. support for Middle East, perhaps built around, oil security for the U.S. Do you think that's going to change anytime soon?
Well, I can make this comment about it. We have been declaring for several decades now that we wanted to be energy independent. For the reasons suggested by your question, which was we do not want to be dependent on oil being imported from the Middle East, which is a trouble spot. Of course, we have far from achieved that. We've gone backwards for up until the last few years. We now have a prospect, indeed, of being, within a few years, I think, North America energy independent, as opposed to just U.S. And therefore, we will not be dependent in the North American continent on imports from the Middle East. On the other hand, we have allies, Western Europe and Japan, who will continue to be dependent on it. So I don't want to suggest, I think it's a good thing for us to have this degree of net energy independence, but I don't think it's going to significantly eliminate the Middle East as a source of national security problems.
Yeah.
The man who led the Japanese fleet at Pearl Harbor, Admiral Yamamoto, had spent a little time in the United States. And after the attack, he allegedly said, "We have awakened a sleeping giant and filled it with resolve." He turned out to be right. I remember I was just graduating from college. I enlisted in the United States Marine Corps, and I spent 2.5 years in the Pacific fighting the war. But everybody responded to Pearl Harbor. And I think the combination of the ISIS emergence and what Mr. Putin is doing, he's tearing up the world order, is in the process of waking up the sleeping giant. We have been sleepwalking. Our economy can take off, and it's pretty simple to know what to do. It's right out there. And we don't have to be hollowing out our military the way it's going on. We can get it back in shape and give some leadership. And that's beginning to happen. And I think, at least I feel, more and more calls come from Washington. Hey, what do we do? How can we get our act together? And that's happening. And I think U.S. leadership is important. Leadership doesn't mean you tell everybody what to do. Leadership means you come with ideas and resources with a problem-solving frame of mind, and then you get something done. And that's going to happen, I think. I have a book I'm working on now, and the title is Earthquake: The Challenge to Government in the 21st Century. It's going to be a very different century. But people have to understand the problem of governance and how to deal with it. And we can do it.
Okay, more questions? Okay, sure, yeah. Oh, why don't we go over here first, and then we'll go back up there, yeah.
What do you think are some of the main reasons why there's such low acceptance for renewable energy?
The question is why do you think that there's such low acceptance for new forms of energy? Why have the renewable energy had such a hard time, gaining traction?
Well, one very real substantive technical reason is the fact that the renewable energy sources are not 24 hours a day. That poses a big problem. And that's why there's so much research going on in the ways of better means of storing energy. Today, the last time I saw the figures, the wind power and solar power were approximately at grid parity, but they're not certainly attractive to the utility companies because of their sporadic nature. The utility companies use them anyway because they are required by law to use them. I don't think they would, on their own initiative, want to do that. So that's a real problem. That's why so much research is being directed to that. So that seems to me that's one of the big reasons that's holding back the broader acceptance of the renewable technologies. George, do you have a different take on that?
Well, the same take, but I have an additional thing to point out, namely that as you study cyber material efforts, and we had a big conference on that the other day, it's perfectly obvious that a determined effort with cyber capability could take out our grid, badly disable it. So what that tells you from the standpoint of energy is that you better figure out how to produce more energy near where you use it. So we're not so dependent on this big distribution system. And right away, there are ways of doing it. Solar is a way of doing it. As Bill says, intermittency is a problem. So large-scale storage is very important. And I think people working on it know this is I think the basic problem is not hard to figure out conceptually. It isn't making a bigger battery. It's storing heat and converting the heat into electricity as you want. It's also true that fuel cells are a good source of energy. And right now, there's a company that produces fuel cells on scale, and you put natural gas over it and you get electricity. And they can do it almost at grid level scale if you want to put enough of their things together. And I keep telling them, pay attention to hydrogen, because I listen to people around here talk about how they're going to get hydrogen out of, say, salt water. And if you can put hydrogen over the fuel cell, which you can, you get electricity, you also get potable water, which is important. Go back to the water problem. So anyway, I think that's important for us to have some focus on how you create energy where you use it and get away from the traditional concept. The traditional concept is built on economics. You build a big power plant somewhere, and then you distribute the power, and that's cheap. And I think the day of that business model is decreasing because of the threats to the grid that we have.
Okay, I think, yeah, how about in the middle, and then we'll go back up to the top. Yeah.
Many speakers in this seminar have stated that if China doesn't take severe steps in reducing its greenhouse emissions, then there will be a significant problem for our world, regardless of what other countries do. And would you like to comment on the international pressure being put to China right now at the level of the international community, and particularly by the United States, to reduce to put pressure to China to reduce its greenhouse emissions?
So the question is, China is the world's biggest greenhouse gas emitter now. Their energy system is going to grow significantly, and they'll, unless they change their energy mix, it's going to continue to put more and more CO2 in the atmosphere. So in terms of other countries, and the rest of the world could all reduce their emissions significantly, but if China doesn't do anything, it's going to be hard to address the climate problem. So do you have thoughts on how China might be brought into the fold to cooperate more?
Well, I think the Chinese government understands that very well, and I think they're very much motivated to reduce the CO2 emissions. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, they have a growing economy. For reasons I'm not going to discuss in detail here, it's important for the government to keep that economy growing. And they don't know any way of making that economy grow without putting more energy into the system. So they have really ambitious plans for bringing nuclear energy online. The last figures I saw were 50 or 60 nuclear reactors. But that's still 10 years away before they're really up and operating full scale. And in the meantime, their economy continues to grow, their energy needs continue to grow. I don't see the solution to the problem. I don't think the Chinese government is going to back off a growing economy, and I don't think they have a way of dealing with that short of coal-fired plants for another 5 to 10 years. So I think we're going to see CO2 emissions continuing to increase in China for the next 5 to 10 years, then probably plateau and then start to go down. In the meantime, there's going to be a lot of damage done, I'm afraid. And maybe we may already be at an irreversible position on the climate change issue. That's a kind of a gloomy forecast. Maybe George has something more encouraging to say.
I'll try. I was in China a couple of years ago with a small group, the so-called Track 2 that Henry Kissinger and I organized. Bill, I think you were present. And at dinner one night, the now President Xi gave a dinner for us. He was known to be becoming premier, but he hadn't become premier yet. He gave a talk, and then he sat with us through dinner. He happened to sit next to me. And I knew that he was going to Washington. So I said to him, on your way to Washington, why don't you stop in San Francisco? We have a Chinese-American mayor, and we've got a big Chinese community, and be welcome. And he said, well, I've already agreed to stop in Los Angeles, so I've done that. But he said, what I'd really like to do is stop at Stanford, because there's something going on around there that I need to get more of a feel for. So somehow he understood the Stanford Silicon Valley creative aspects. I told this to John Hennessy, and I said, And he said, issue an invitation immediately. So he may have been that calm. But anyway, it was interesting. He understood that. And it seems to me what we should do is go to the Chinese government and say, look, let's make a deal. You are the biggest emitter. We are the biggest per capita emitter, the United States. So if we start doing things that start working, it'll have a big ripple effect all over the world, not only on us. So let's put our emphasis not on what we aspire to be by 2050, but by what we can do today. And let's make a little side deal on intellectual property so we get that problem straightened away. And there are lots of things going on in the R&D community that are applicable. But you take shale. China has gigantic shale deposits. And they are thought to be inaccessible, hard to access. For a long time, that was the view of the United States shale deposits. People knew they were there, they just didn't know how to get at them. I might say the fracking revolution is a classic product of R&D combined with entrepreneurship. It wasn't just a company that did this. There's a lot of R&D supported by the federal government that preceded it. So I think we ought to say to China, look, you have these big deposits, and everywhere they're different. So it takes research and it takes ingenuity. And let's work together to see if we can't figure out how to exploit those resources, because they're huge. And if suddenly China has a new big supply of gas, that would have a big impact. So that's just an example. But then I think, another time I was in China, I had a meeting with the premier, and it took me almost an hour to get from my hotel to where we were meeting. If there had been no traffic, it would have cost me about 10 minutes. But most of the time, my car is just sitting there idling in traffic. So I said to him, in China, these cities, of course, are very heavily polluted. And people have, it's a major health problem for them. They know that. So I said, that time I was driving a Prius. I said to him, if I had the car here that I have on the Stanford campus, you would save a huge amount of the pollution that cars are just sitting there idling. Huge. So why don't you encourage China to move to, this is not new technology, it's being sold by Toyota right now and others. Move to that kind of a car, and all of a sudden you change things. I think there are a lot of things that can be done by working back and forth, and we have some things we can learn from China, I'm sure. So it can be a two-way exercise if we could set it up on a cooperative basis. And at least from my own experience in office with the Chinese, it's really easy to do. People, I mean, they see they need it for their pollution of their cities and their attitude toward what's going on in the world. They know that. They're smart. So if we have a method, a problem-solving method, it doesn't have big principles of some kind, we solve problems. We get energy used more efficiently. We get various new kinds of things evolved. We learn how to exploit their shale. And maybe you get one of these smart entrepreneurs, and don't worry if he makes a lot of money. So he deserves to make a lot of money if he can figure out how to solve that problem. So let's get at it. And if we did it together and put a lot of our entrepreneurial juices into it, as well as collaborate, we could really get somewhere. So if I were in office right now, that's what I'd be trying to put together. And I have seen enough of Mr. Xi, and my wife has, to feel that he is the kind of person that would respond to that.
Okay. Well, you know, unfortunately, we've come to the end of our time, but I just would like to offer to our two guests some final words of advice to this fine young class of incoming graduate students. Anything you'd like to add?
Well, I'd just like to underline the importance of what you're doing. It's important to you personally, but it has huge implications on a global basis. Number one. Number two, there is no better time to be working on this subject than right now, because the funding is there, the colleagues are there, there's an ongoing research that you can learn from and build on, and it's a golden moment.
There's nothing more important for the globe or for the country of getting the energy right. There are very important technological potential improvements coming along, and you're in a position to try to advance those. But technology is not enough here. It also combines with how you use it, understanding of what makes the difference, how it affects other things, how it affects the climate. So you have to bring together in your thinking not just technological advances, but the policy that affects how it is used. Together, they make a powerful combination.
Okay, well, please, join me in thanking our guests.